Hey y'all, it's Die Banksters for BlueFirePoker.com, and welcome to the 5th installment of my Sit and Go building block series. In this episode, we're going to talk about getting the most from your HUD. For this video, we'll be focusing on the heads-up display for Hold'em Manager. We're going to talk about some cautions when using a heads-up display. Then we'll look at some stats that are useful for sit and goes, and we'll look at some factors that go into constructing your own HUD layout. There are a number of factors you need to take into account when using stats from your HUD, and the first and most important of these factors is the sample size that your stats are based on. We have a need to balance the quality of the information we're using versus the quantity of the sample that these stats are based on. Individual stat sample size filters in Hold'em Manager allow us to do this. And remember that having no data is actually preferable to having flawed data that's based on small samples. And also, we have to take into account that if we have a lot of stats on our opponent, he also has a lot of stats on you as well. So there's definitely going to be some multi-level thinking going on. Remember that different stats are based on different samples. For example, VPIP is based on all pre-flop hands where you had a choice, where you could make a decision. 3-bet stats are based only on hands where you're facing a pre-flop raise. And went to showdown stats are based on hands only where there was a flop seen. So because of this, we're going to end up with very different sample sizes for all of our different stats. We need to make use of the minimum sample size filters in Hold'em Manager, because in sit and goes we don't gather very much history against our random opponents. And if we require a very large sample size, it can limit the stats too much, but if we use too small of a sample size, the stats lose all meaning. A 10-hand minimum sample size is usually pretty good for these individual stats, and it's absolutely the bare minimum that we can use for any type of meaningfulness. And I recommend using the adjust color for sample size feature in Hold'em Manager to give you an idea of how accurate your sample is. And this will make the color of your stat appear darker the more of a sample size that you have for that particular stat. One very important thing is to make sure that you set your minimum hands for stats on the table preferences window to 0 to ensure that all hands will get counted. And then we use, underneath the player preferences, we use the minimum samples feature for each individual stat to specify a minimum sample there. Also here we want to make sure that we adjust color for sample size, so make sure you have that checkbox checked there. Couple more cautions we want to give you. Number one, that's sample size dating. And the dating of our sample size matters because all players adapt their style and skill level over time. Studying, coaching, tilt, or tilt control can all affect a player's style over a very short period of time. So using hands that are too old can cause issues because of these factors. Hands less than 3 months old should give you something close to accuracy for most players. Another thing to really take into account is that sit and goes are so situationally dependent. ICM and bubble factor considerations can drastically affect a player's range in different situations. And shoving ranges will be very different from calling ranges in most situations, and those will both differ from their early and mid-game ranges. And you really need to understand how different hands are playable in different situations. Even though their stats might look the same, the actual cards within that range are going to be very different. And make sure you take these factors into account, but you also have to think about how well your opponent understands these factors and make sure that's part of your decision. And finally, we have to realize that not all players value hands the same. I like to say that one man's Queen Jack suited is another man's Ace 10 offsuit. So you need to try to understand what hand strength factors your opponent values the most, such as suitedness, connectedness, or high card strength. Next, we're going to talk about some specific HUD stats, and I'm going to break them up into 3 categories. First, we're going to talk about what I consider to be the essential stats, and these are stats that require smaller overall sample sizes, and therefore they can be more useful against randoms who we don't have a lot of history with, and they're also the easiest stats to interpret. Next, I'll show you some more stats that I recommend that you use. Most of these stats require a larger sample size than the essential stats, and they usually won't mean as much against randoms, but they are very useful against regulars. And interpreting these stats will take a little more skill and will require more judgment on your part. And finally, I'll show you some optional stats, and these will require the largest overall sample size. And they're only very useful against the opponents you play the most, but against those opponents you will have a lot of data, and you can look for more weaknesses to exploit by using these stats. Also, they're very useful in regular speed games where you'll get a lot more hands in per blind level, and thus you'll have a larger sample size to work off of. So in the essential category, I use limp, call open, pre-flop raise, steal percentage, fold to steal, aggression factor, and number of hands. And the first 2 you might notice are very different from what a lot of people use. The standard is pretty much VPIP, but I'll show you later why I prefer limp and call open over VPIP. Next, in the recommended stats, we have VPIP, 3-bet, 3-bet versus steal, flop C-bet, fold to flop C-bet, the positional stealing stats, positional folding to steal stats, went to showdown, and the number of big blinds. And finally, the optional ones, which are fold to 3-bet, fold to re-steal, raise first in, squeeze, call versus steal, check raise, donk bet to flop, bet versus miss C-bet in position, bet versus a miss C-bet out of position, and one money, one soft flop. So the first one we're going to cover in the essential stats is the limp stat. And in your HUD, it's under the category of limp. And this is when someone just calls it an unraised pot rather than raising or folding. And it's calculated by totaling up the number of times that the player limps divided by the total playable hands. And in this situation, total playable hands are hands where the player could actually make a decision whether or not to limp. Forced all ins, such as when they're completely short stacked and are forced all in to cover the ante or the blinds, and also posted big blind hands do not count in the total playable hands. A couple of cautions when using this stat, and number 1 is beware of facing a limp re-raise when isolating a limper that has a very low limp percentage. Some good uses for this stat is when we have a player that has a high limp percentage, they make good targets for isolation raises or shoves when in position. And we can compare the limp percentage to their pre-flop raise percentage to narrow down their range by eliminating most of their pre-flop raise range from his limping range. The next of the essential stats is call open, and it's under the HUD category of call open. And this is when a player is facing a raise pre-flop and they just call rather than raising or folding. And this is the number of times a player calls a raise divided by the number of times the player is facing a raise. This only counts a single raise before the player has acted. Hands where the player was facing a 3-bet are not counted in factoring this stat. The caution when using this stat is that if a player that has position on you has a very high call open percentage, beware of raising the bottom of your range against this player if you feel you may have trouble post flop against them, or if you think he has a good reason to call a shove. Some uses for this stat are that it's helpful when determining your fold equity and likely calling range of your opponent when considering a shove or a raise. And you can compare this stat to the pre-flop range, the pre-flop raise range, the VPIP, and his limp range to gauge what his overall range would be if he calls you. Next to the essential stats is pre-flop raise, PFR, and it's in the HUD category of PFR. And this is how often the player raises pre-flop. This includes raising limpers and 3-betting. And it's calculated by taking the total number of hands where the player raised, dividing that by total playable hands. In this situation, total playable hands does include hands where the BB was posted, but it excludes forced all-ins because obviously the player could not raise. And a caution when using this stat, you really need to be aware of how positionally aware your villain is. If he's not very positionally aware, then his PFR is going to be pretty accurate for all positions that he's at. But for most players, a high PFR does not necessarily mean a wide range from all positions, particularly if the villain has a very high steal percentage. Most players will be raising a much wider range from the later positions than the earlier positions. Basic ABC poker there. And some uses for this stat, it's very useful when determining whether or not to call a raise, to 3-bet, or to fold to a raise or a shove. The next of the essential stats is the overall steal percentage, and this is in the HUD category of steal. This is defined as when someone raises from the cutoff button or small blind, but only in unopened pots, and is calculated by taking the total number of raises they have made from the cutoff button or small blind in unopened pots, dividing that by the number of unopened pots that the player was in when they were in one of those positions. Some cautions about using this stat: it's very sensitive to positional awareness, and this is because most players raise much less from the cutoff than they do from the button, but not all players raise more from the small blind than they do from the button. Many players like the fact that they are in position from the button and therefore tend to raise a lot more if they feel uncomfortable playing out of position. This doesn't necessarily pertain to late game, but it's more to early game situations. And some uses of the stat: it's much more accurate than using the pre-flop raise percentage when considering re-stealing or calling a steal or a shove. And that's because the PFR takes into account all positions, but this stat only takes into account the actual stealing positions. And we can use the positional steal stats to narrow down a player's range when we're facing a shove or a standard steal. The next of the essential stats is fold versus steal, and it's also in the HUD category of steal. And this is how often a player folds to a steal attempt. And it's simply calculated by the number of times the player folds to a steal divided by the number of times the player faces a steal. Couple of cautions with this. Number one is that your table image and stats can dramatically affect how often a villain will fold to your steal attempts. So the player may have a very high fold to steal percentage, but you might have been shoving or stealing, the last couple orbits, and he might decide to take a stand against you. A couple of uses for this stat: if a player has a very high fold versus steal percentage, you can exploit this to your advantage by stealing much wider against him, and you can compare this number to the player's re-steal percentage to get an idea of how successful your steal attempt will be, basically your fold equity, and what type of range you could be up against if the player does raise you or calls your steal or your shove. Another of the essential stats is the aggression factor, and this is in the HUD category of aggression. And AF is defined as a comparison of the aggressive actions a player takes, such as betting and raising, to the passive actions that the player can take, which only includes calling. And it's the times that the player has bet or raised post-flop divided by the times the player has called post-flop. Checking and folding are completely ignored in this formula. Aggression factor will give you a pretty good idea of how aggressive or passive the player is, but it will not be situation at all. It includes all post-flop situations into this, so it can really give you a solid idea of their overall aggressive or passiveness, but it's not going to be very helpful in very specific situations. Some ways we can use this to our benefit, though, is that when a player has a very low aggression factor, such as around 1.5 or lower, we can bet our strong hands for value and be wary of draw heavy boards if the opponent is likely to call a lot. And when a player has a very high aggression factor, we should tend to give their bets or raises a little less respect, and we might be able to play a slightly weaker hand range against them. Of course, this all depends on their pre-flop range as well, so we have to use all these stats in conjunction with each other. Now we'll talk about some of the recommended stats, and first is VPIP. And VPIP is the percentage of hands that the player voluntarily put money in the pot. The small blind, big blind, and ante-postings are not counted as voluntary unless they add more money, like completing from the small blind, or if the big blind calls a raise or raises himself. And the VPIP is calculated as hands where the player raised or called divided by total playable hands. VPIP can be a very misleading stat if it's not used in conjunction with other stats. A player can have a very high VPIP because he limps a lot, but he'll ever call a raise. If this player does call a raise, you must take this into account and assume a fairly strong range for this player. And a couple of uses for VPIP: it can give you a general idea on how loose or tight a player is, but it's not very accurate for narrowing down the player's range. We can compare the VPIP to the player's PFR, limp, and call open stats to get a better sense of their true range. Some more recommended stats. Number one is 3-bet, and it's under the category of 3-bet under the HUD player preferences. And this is when a player re-raises after another player has already raised. Only hands where the player faced the raised are considered in the calculation. We can check the 3-bet stats of players yet to act when we ourselves are considering raising with a marginal hand. If we're likely to get 3-bet, we might want to let that one go. Light 3-betting isn't very common in sit-and-goes, so we should expect a fairly strong raise when we are facing a 3-bet. The next is the 3-bet versus a steal, or the re-steal stat. And this is also under the 3-bet category in the HUD player preferences. And this is when a player re-raises when faced with the steal raise. And we can use the re-steal stat of a player to aid in determining our fold equity or our hand strength versus their range when we're considering calling a re-steal. But we must remember that light re-stealing is actually very common in sit and goes, so we have to have a plan to counteract this. If the player after us is very likely to re-steal, we should take this into account and either adjust our bet size or adjust our range to make it more beneficial towards us. A couple more recommended stats are the positional stealing stats from the cutoff button in small blind, and these are very useful in determining a player's shoving ranges in the late game. Also, the positional fold to steal stats from the small blind and big blind, and these are very useful in determining fold equity late game, especially with 5 or less players remaining. And this is because there will be many more shoves going on at that time of the game, and also many more of the shoves are going to be from actual stealing positions, so these fold to steal stats will have a much bigger sample size to work with at that stage of the game. And another one is the number of big blinds that the player has, but we need to be aware that the number of big blinds that Hold'em Manager displays is based on the last hand that was imported, so they're not always 100% accurate if the blind level had recently changed since the last import. A couple useful post-flop stats are the flop c-bet and fold to flop c-bet stats. And if a player has a very high fold to flop c-bet stat, around 60% or so, we can exploit this by c-betting them to death. If it's much lower, we should tend to only semi-bluff or value bet against this player. If a player has a very high flop c-bet percentage, then we could consider floating or raising their c-bet to exploit this fact. And finally, it's the went to showdown percentage. And this is very useful in figuring out how likely you are to get an opponent to fold if we are on a maybe turn or river situation, or how likely we are to get him to pay us off with weaker hands. If their went to showdown percentage is very high, we know that their general showdown hand strength is not very strong. Next, we'll look at a couple optional stats. First of which is the check raise, and it's in the HUD category of check raise. And the definition for the stat is their overall check raise percentage. For this stat, it does not matter who the aggressor in the hand was for the calculation of this stat. Because of this, it can be useful when you are c-betting in position or when you are facing a pre-flop raiser who checks to you on the flop. If in either of these situations the player has a very high check raise percentage, it might be beneficial to check behind unless you have a very strong hand. Next is the donk bet flop stat, and it's in the HUD category of donk bet. And this is how often someone bets into the flop out of position after calling a pre-flop raise. For this stat, 3-bet pots are not included in the calculation. And it can be very useful in countering weak leads. If a player has a high donk bet percentage and then makes a pretty small bet on the flop, usually this is a sign of weakness, and you can usually raise them and get them off of the hand. However, you must be aware of tricky opponents that can exploit this fact by appearing weak when they're actually strong. Apparently they've read Sun Tzu's The Art of War. And finally, a couple more optional stats, and these are the bet versus miss c-bet stats. And these are really only useful against players that you have a whole lot of sample size against, and also only really useful in games where there's a whole lot of post-flop play, especially regular speed games and more loose aggressive games where there might be a lot more post-flop play. The first one is the in position bet versus miss c-bet stat, and this is in the HUD category of continuation bets. And this stat is defined as how often the villain bets when the pre-flop raiser does not c-bet and the villain is in position. And this is based on flop, turn, and river situations, so double and triple barreling situations are considered. And this stat only applies where the villain is last to act. You can counter a villain who has a high value for this stat by check raising more often to get more value from your stronger hands. Then there's the out of position stat, which is also in the continuation bet category, and this is how often a villain leads the next street of the hand after their opponent fails to c-bet in position on the previous street. And you can exploit a villain who has a high value for this stat by taking a pot control line with more mediocre and medium strength hands, by checking behind on the flop instead of c-betting and maybe calling a small bet on the turn. And also, if you are drawing in the hand, you can exploit villains that have a high value for this stat by taking the free card and let them bet into you on the next street if your draw hits. Next, we'll look at the various methods for filtering out the stats that our HUD uses. Since game conditions change so rapidly throughout the course of a sit and go, we need a way to filter out our stats to give them a little bit of extra meaning. And Hold'em Manager has it built in two different filter types. They are filter by number of players and filter by the effective stack. Using a hybrid of both of these can dramatically affect the quality of our stats. Under the HUD options, additional HUD filters, we can find the filter for the number of players. And here we can set the minimum and maximum number of players that a hand should have to have their stats considered for this situation. The only situation that I really set a specific min and max for this filter is for heads up hands, and I like to have that set for a minimum of 2 and a max of 3. And that's because for most players that we end up facing heads up, we do not have a large sample size on them, and once we reach heads up, we should at least have some of our hands from when we were three-handed, so that we don't end up with no stats at all against this player. And then for the remaining numbers of players, I just set the minimum at 3. There are a couple different schools of thoughts for this. A lot of people like to set up ranges here for different phases of the game, like 7 through 9 players and 5 and 6 players, bubble specific hands. But I feel that using the effective stack filters in conjunction with the way I have this set up gives us the biggest sample size and still maintains some pretty good accuracy. For the shorthanded situations like 5 or less players, we're more or less relying on the positional stealing and fold to steal stats, because by that time we're almost always in the push fold stage of the game, and those stats are going to have a whole lot of relevance at that part of the game. Also notice on this tab that there's also the filter by date section where we can set how old hands can be to be considered for use in our HUD. Next, we'll look at these effective stack filters, and you could set these by going to HUD options, HUD tourney filters, and you can, on this page, you can set up what effective stack size you want considered for each individual stack size in terms of big blinds on the left. So the way to interpret this is if the player currently has an effective stack size of, say, 5 big blinds, only hands where he had an effective stack size of 3 to 7 big blinds will be considered. And this is very useful for sit and goes because so much of our time is spent in those stack sizes that are less than 15 big blinds. And you really need to work around with these stats and find out, or with these settings, and find out what numbers work for you. The games that I play in, I tend to get a lot more stats on the opponents I'm playing, and therefore I have a pretty narrow range for my stats here, how a lot of them are set only with a 4 blind range between 1 to 5. And also you want to have quite a bit of overlap between them, just so if a player all of a sudden gets to a, say, 6 blind stack, if you had it set without overlap, then all of a sudden his stats are going to reset back to 0. Another useful feature on this page is to include a big blind VPIP PFR grid in the HUD pop-up. And what that will do is put a little spade icon on your heads-up display for each player. And if you click that spade icon, it'll bring up this pop-up. And it will show their VPIP and their PFR for different situations. For example, with 1 to 3 big blinds in an unopened pot. In early position, this player had a VPIP of 34 and a PFR of 23. And this can be really effective using this against players that you have a whole lot of stats on and in a very large sample size. And none of the filters that you apply are going to affect this. This is totally unfiltered data here, which makes it very, very useful because it's already split up into very specific categories. Next, we're going to talk about some factors to consider when constructing the perfect HUD layout. First, I want to point out this is the main HUD that I use, and it's a whole lot of stats, a lot more stats than most players use, most people that I've encountered. But I have it set up in a pretty efficient manner so that I can use everything and use the space that I have on my screen to, maximize the space that I have. And the number one way I'd make this simpler for me is by keeping all similar stats together. So I have all of my basic pre-flop stats on one line, all of my stealing stats on another line, the fold to steal stats on a separate line, my post-flop stats, and then some other miscellaneous stats on the bottom line. And you can really make use of the different panels and lines features that Hold'em Manager has built in to really set up an effective layout for yourself. Also, I make use of abbreviations, very simple ones, just so I know exactly what stat I'm looking at. And another very effective thing is to use the color coding for different stats, and I just have it set up with a very basic system, red, yellow, green, and usually use the red ones for narrower ranges where I need to be more cautious, yellow or for the intermediate ones, and green if their stats are very high and it's a go. Another feature that I like to make use of is the fact that you can decide if you want to display stats for yourself or for your opponents. For almost all stats, I do not display them for myself. It just takes up screen real estate that you don't really have, and you really don't need to know your stats too much. There are only a few stats that I show for myself, and those are PFR, steal, and number of hands and number of big blinds. There are many more useful features on the Appearance tab of the Player Preferences window, which will allow you to get the most out of your HUD. And this is where you can really make sure you get the perfect layout and the most usefulness you can out of your HUD. The most effective feature on this tab is the ability to set any font that you would like. And after experimenting with virtually all of them, I found that the Arial narrow bold font is the most effective for me. And it's a very clear, legible font that takes up a very small footprint, which allows you to pack a lot of information into a very small area. Also, if you're using abbreviations, make sure you have that feature checked. And also, if you plan to use multiple panels, make sure that is checked as well. Also, I like to show the table averages, which is very useful when multi-tabling, and it really gives you a good idea of the general flow of the table, whether or not the table is playing very aggressive or very passive. Another very useful thing is the ability to scale your font, and what this feature does is keep your font size the same relative to the size of your table. Whether you make your table smaller or bigger, the font size will adjust to stay the same relative to that table size. Another really good thing is the ability to set your different background colors. And I like to use a transparent background. That way I'm not blocking out any action that's happening behind my HUD. And you can also set an alternate background, and what the alternate background is for when you double click on your HUD, it will show the stats for the current session only, which means for that current table. It's not incredibly useful for sit and goes because you really want to use the biggest sample size you can, so using session only stats really kind of limits you way too much. And the default text is simply the color of the abbreviations and the table averages and so forth. Finally, I just wanted to give you a quick view of my HUD in action to show you that if you take the time and experiment a lot, you can really pack a whole lot of information into a very small area. Notice that with the transparent background, you can pretty much cover up your opponent's cards but still be able to see behind when they do show their hand. And also with the use of the multiple panels, we can have stats above and below the player's name and stack size and still be able to see everything clearly. And I think it's a pretty simple and effective layout overall, but it might be a little bit of information overload for some people. That's why you really need to experiment around, see what works for you. And these were all just my opinion and the things that worked the best for me, but again, really don't know what's going to work for you until you try it all. This has been Die Banksters for BlueFirePoker.com, and I want to thank you for your time today. Happy HUDing.